2004. So he turned, 70. Welcome to the 7th floor. He turned 70 about 2 months ago. So belated congratulations to you. He is married with 3 young, adults, 1 male and 2 females. He was the acting dean of the School of Performing Arts, University of Ghana from 2014 to 2021, acting director, School of Performing Arts, University of Ghana 2013 to 2014, co-coordinator, English Akan Science Dictionary Project, head of Department of Linguistics, University of Ghana 2010 to 2013, and co-coordinator, Akan Dictionary Project, University of Ghana from 1997 to 2007. His areas of research are ethnography of communication, linguistics, anthropology, pragmatics, discourse analysis, language and politics, mother tongue education, socio-linguistics, stylistics, semantics, cognitive, semantics, body part expressions, translation, terminology, lexicology, lexicography, and oral literature. Professor Agyekum has published in many renowned international and local journals, such as Pragmatics and Cognition, Journal of Pragmatics Discourse Studies, Language and Dialogue, Journal of Language and Politics, Anthropological Research, Language and Society, International Journal of Language and Culture, International Journal of Language and Communication, RASK, Metaphor and the Social World, Cognitive Linguistics, Science, etc. His latest books are Akan Kasadwi and Akan Body Part Expressions. He is an internationally recognized Akan and ethnography of communication scholar and has been quoted and consulted by scholars and institutions at both local and international levels. Professor Agyekum has 87 journal articles and book chapters and 16 books. He has also written 5 modules in linguistics for the Institute of Continuing and Distance Education, University of Ghana. He has reviewed 5 books and many journal articles. Professor Kofi Agyekum taught Akan and linguistics at the former School of Languages, Agyekum from 1982 to 1985, and also at the University of Ghana, University of Cape Coast, and University of Education, Winneba. He has been teaching Akan to American students in Ghana since 1997. He was a visiting scholar at the University of Athens, Ohio, in the summer of 2004. Professor Agyekum has done a lot of consultancy work on Akan media and translation for CRA, JIMPA, ISE, NALAB, UN QUIPS, USAID, DOVSU, APRM, GPRS2, Ashanti Gold, UNESCO chapter on culture, UNESCO Ghana Women's Mortality, Panos Institute, West Africa, Dakar, Senegal, ASTEP, Ghana Ring Project, CDD Ghana, Accra, Attorney General's Department, Unimax Publishers, Expert Facilitator for Media and Politicians, towards peaceful elections in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, which were all organized by ECOWAS. He has been a member of various boards and committees at the University of Ghana and at the national level. These include the National Peace Council, the National Film and Television Institute, NAFTI, National Theatre, Ghana Institute of Languages, and Presbyterian University College of Ghana. He is also a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, member International Pragmatics Association, IPRA, member African Pragmatics Association, and member Linguistics Association of Ghana, LAG. Professor Kofi Agyekum has received special awards, humanitarian awards, Ghana Honorary Division in 2020, Kwame Nkrumah Genius Award for the use of mother tongue in the media in 2017, National Award, the Order of the Volta for Public Education and the Media in 2008, and University of Ghana's Best Teacher Award for the Humanities in 2007. Apart from these special national awards, he has received many others from churches, institutions, agencies, and traditional societies. Professor Kofi Agyekum was the first who introduced newspaper review in Akan at Radio Universe in April 1997. The program was titled Ephraim, and it is still aired on Radio Universe Legon. He was the host of Ephraim and Obiara Nkabi programs on Radio Universe and has trained many student trainee journalists. He is a regular panelist on Peace FM's Kukuruku show. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Kofi Agyekum.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Chairperson and President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, henceforth GAAS. Executive of GAAS. Okay. Before I start, we have the Presby Choir of Ebenezer Church, Medina here. Emmanuel Church of Medina. And that was where my mentor, Emeritus Professor J.H. Nketia, was fellowship. Before I start, I think it's proper I ask them to give us one song. Thank you. Lovely. Chairperson and President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, henceforth GAAS, executives of GAAS, fellows and the Secretariat of GAAS, invited guests, the media, ladies and gentlemen, good evening again. I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the series of Ephraim Amu Memorial Lectures. The topic of my lecture is the significance of Ephraim Amu's defiance of cultural imperialism. There are many definitions of cultural imperialism. However, in this presentation, I shall operate with the definition given by Oliver Barrett, who writes, and I quote, "Central to the many definitions of the term cultural imperialism is the idea of the culture of one powerful civilization, country, or institution having great unreciprocated influence on that of another less powerful entity, to a degree that one may speak of a measure of cultural domination." So under cultural imperialism, there's somebody dominating another. And if we move further, we are going to find out that cultural imperialism encodes a lot of things. Although Amu is famously known for his pioneering contributions to ethnomusicology in Ghana, his defiance of cultural imperialism is equally important, given that the defiance was in defense of our cultural identity and dignity. Bear in mind that whoever has no identity has no dignity. So if you are here and you can't identify with any group, with any ethnic group, with any language, then you don't have dignity. And whoever has no dignity also has no identity. It is also to be noted that the notion of cultural identity does not require a people to have the autonomous capacity to practice every aspect of their culture. That is impossible. You can't do all. However dysfunctional it will be, it requires only the practice of those aspects of their culture which define their uniqueness. So if you're a Ga, there are certain aspects of Ga that will make you a Ga. Today, more than ever before, these two values, namely our cultural identity and dignity, are under significant threat. It is true that we no longer live in the colonial days of Amu, when the physically present European colonizers or their Christian missionaries used African minions to dictate what to wear, what music to play, and what language to speak at public or institutional events, and possibly what food to eat. Nevertheless, I shall argue that what we have now, namely cultural globalization, could in some respects be as deadly as, if not deadlier, than physical colonization. This is so because the quiet, faceless, and seemingly impersonal features of cultural globalization tend to hide its potential for endless social penetration, scope of influence, and therefore erosion of our weaker cultures. In this tidal onslaught, a lot of vigilance and energy are required at all material times to detect significant erosions of our cultural identity and preserve it. Meeting this challenge will also serve to continue the efforts, preserve the memory, and gratify the spirit of Dr. Ephraim Amu. Mr. Chairman, the rest of this presentation is divided into 5 sections. Section 1 will be a brief account of Amu's biography, whose purpose is to set the context of Amu's life. Section 2 teases out of Amu's biography the scope and meaning of Amu's defiance of cultural imperialism. Section 3 takes a brief look at the post-Amu age, namely the age of cultural globalization, and argues that our cultural identity and dignity are under a more serious threat now than before. And that threat requires us to engage in an ideological fight or defiance to protect and preserve them. To this end, Section 4 takes a brief look at how the state has positioned itself to preserve and protect our cultural identity and dignity. Talking about the role of the state means looking at the aspect of the Constitution that deals with culture, and also the cultural policy of Ghana, whose creation was overseen by the National Commission on Culture, which is also the main implementing agency. Section 5 is devoted to conclusions and recommendations. So, Mr. Chair, I start with Section 1, which is a brief biography of Ephraim Amu. Ephraim Koku Amu was born on Wednesday, 13 September 1899 at Peki Avetile in the Volta region of Ghana. Amu passed away on 2nd January 1995 at the age of 96. He was a renowned ethnomusicologist who composed several choral and patriotic songs. The most popular among them is Yena Yasasini, This Our Own Land, composed in 1929 when Amu was only 30 years. The song continues to inspire Ghanaian nationalism and patriotism as it is performed at national and other major public events. Other compositions of Amu are Bonyuri Kente, Asemi Dika, Kona Kotutu, Yanum Abibimbe, Momayan Kosomfro that we just heard, and Eslom Miele. There are many, and I can't be mentioning all of them. In recognition of Amu's phenomenal contributions to ethnomusicology and education, he received many awards, some of them posthumous. These awards include 2 honorary doctorate degrees in music, respectively awarded by the University of Ghana in 1965 and Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in 1976. The Grand Medal of the Republic of Ghana in 1972. Order of the Volta in 1973. And then, if you remember very well, between 2002 and 2007, Amu's portrait was embossed on the 20,000 old Ghana cedis note, the highest denomination at that time. And he needs an applause for that. Those who are young may not have seen that 20,000. In a biographical brief by the Amu family, it is stated that, and I quote, "There's no single individual who has influenced the cause of development of art music in contemporary Ghana as much as Amu." True or false? You know better than I do. In the same family biography of Amu, we find that Amu pioneered and encouraged the Africanization of the church by introducing the singing of Ghanaian songs during worship. Furthermore, Amu developed, redesigned, and popularized the wind instrument called atenteben that we see around, the flute, and 2 other wind instruments called odruja and odrujaba, a kind of flute or pipe used in the performance of mournful music before a king. Finally, in virtue of his multilingual dexterity, Amu composed songs in Twi, Ewe, Ga, and English. Again, in a foreword to Liar's 2012 book, Nketia in June 2010 wrote the following about Amu, and I quote, this coming from Nketia: "I also admired Amu not only for his creative mind, but also for his commitment to the cause of culture and national development in Ghana, evident in the manner in which he managed to combine this with his role of that of an educator, a social critic, and cultural activist concerned with issues of tradition and innovation, the role of patriotism in nation building, and the moral code of civil society. End of quote. During the commissioning of the Institute of African Studies on the 25th of October 1963, the then president of Ghana, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, mentioned Professor J.T. Nketia, Kofi Antobam, and Ephraim Amu, among others, as having contributed to African culture, oral tradition, poetry, literature, and culture. But listen, regarding Amu, Nkrumah said, and I quote, "I may mention here Ephraim Amu, whose work has created and established a Ghanaian style of music and revived on appreciation for it." This is Nkrumah speaking. Dr. Ephraim Amu's formal education, as we might have heard earlier on, began at the Bremen Mission School at Peki Abetile Primary School 1906 to 1912, and Peki Blengo Middle Boarding School 1912 to 1915. In January 1916, he enrolled at the Basel Mission Seminary at Abetifi Kweu and trained as a catechist and a teacher. He acquired fluency in P, which explains why the lyrics of his best-known songs are in P rather than in ever his native language. Amu was employed to teach music and agriculture at the Ekropon Training College in 1926. He was appointed a house master, singing band teacher, choir master, and also a preacher at the Presbyterian Church. This one man doing all this. Needless to say, Amu performed all of these very competently. At Ekropon, Amu sought explicitly and implicitly to undermine the European hegemony on culture and fought to project the best in African culture. One of the things he did, according to Agyekum 1988, page 34, was that in 1929, Amu selected proverbial tree names for 4 new college dormitories, instead of the usual naming by cardinal numbers, such as House 1, House 2, House 3. I remember I was in House 3. House 4. Amu said no. Amu named them respectively Tikro Nkwejina, meaning 2 hairs are better than 1. So one of your grandfathers could have been in Tikro Nkwejina house. Achichiria Nenwa, the tortoise and the small. So house be me wachichiria Nenwa, implying peaceful coexistence. Pinedo, do your best, go on. And then a funtumreku ni denchemreku, 2 animals with 1 stomach, or more profoundly, unity in diversity. So this somebody who was not interested in the house 1, house 2, house 3, house 4, but some proverbial names to him was the best. Even more significantly, Amu learned in his early years that African languages could more effectively facilitate the propagation of the Christian faith. And now that is what we are doing. You open your set and people are preaching in Ga, in P, in all the languages. He therefore resorted to composing songs and preaching in the indigenous languages. In appraising Amu, Agyekum writes as follows, and I quote, "Amu's efforts to make Christian church worship more meaningful to African worshippers must be seen as a great act of faith at a time in our history when many literate and school-educated people were ashamed of their African culture." I think that is still going on. In terms of clothing, language, music, and even their African names. Amu's work was part of the African and Black Revolution. Amu was dismissed from the Agyekum Training College. I've said he was teaching there, music and agric. In explaining what precipitated the dismissal, AYEE 1998 wrote, and I quote, "In 1931, Amu mounted the pulpit dressed in ntoma, as I'm wearing. He was banned from preaching, but he held on tenaciously to his convictions in spite of the sanction. Reverend Peter Hall, a former moderator, tried to convince him to change his mind, since his rigid stance might undermine his chance of being ordained as a clergyman. Amu thought it was better to dispense with the long-cherished desire of becoming a minister than compromise his stand." So I'm also trying to find out whether with this I will not be sacked from GAAS. I hope I'm good to go. Oh, my chairman is even wearing. Okay, so that's fine. So I'm safe now. So somebody being dismissed because he was wearing ntoma to preach. That's one of the highest levels of cultural imperialism. AYEE also states that the church authorities judged that by wearing African attire in the pulpit, Amu was lowering the standards of Christianity and drawing back the clock of civilization, since his action offended the sensibilities of the majority of educated and non-educated in the community. They could excuse the use of the Twi language, but wearing native clothes was completely unacceptable. But I'm told that what I'm wearing is acceptable. Amu had deep-seated Christian convictions, but he could not tolerate cultural impositions that suppressed or denied his identity and dignity as a Ghanaian and as an African. In praising Amu's courage, Agyekum notes, the official church displeasure and ultimatum did not deter Amu from his purpose. He was convinced that he was doing the right thing by researching, understanding, and enhancing African culture. How many of us can do that? He was not going to change course. After Amu had been dismissed from Agyekum Training College, he got a job as a full-time staff at Achimota School. That is Yeyu Babia Kobebi, where he taught from January 1934 to September 1951. In 1951, Amu relocated with other Achimota staff and old students to Kumasi, where the music school at Achimota had been transferred as part of the College of Arts, Science and Technology, now KNUST. Amu retired from teaching in 1960 and was soon recruited as the foundational member of the Institute of African Studies in University of Ghana at Legon. So if I've dismissed me at Agyekum, I have Achimota, I've gone to Kumasi, I'm back to Legon. Say hallelujah to Amu. He retired from the University of Ghana as a senior research fellow in 1971 and returned to Peki Abertile, where he died in 1995. May his soul rest in perfect peace. For our purposes this evening, let the foregoing suffice for Amu's biography. Although this is a very brief biographical account, it clearly portrays a multi-talented Amu. He was a poet, a nationalist, theologian, teacher, and a multilingual person who has bequeathed us with multiple cultural legacies. However, the focus of this lecture is on the significance of Amu's defiance of cultural imperialism. To this end, Mr. Chair, the next section, namely section 2, will be devoted to appraising the scope and meaning of Amu's defiance of cultural imperialism. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, from the snippets of biographical data which we have just looked at, it appears that Amu registered his defiance of cultural imperialism in many ways, but for the sake of time, we shall concentrate on only 4 of these. 1, preaching in the local language, Twi at Agyekum. It was a defiance. Writing songs in local languages and encouraging singing, whether in the college or in the church, was the second defiance. The third, insisting on wearing African clothes to preach. And the fourth one, resiliently and courageously insisting on doing what he believed was right, no matter the consequences. Before giving an account of these 4 forms of cultural defiance, it must be noted that Amu was not against all forms of imperialist influence. Far from that. After all, he was a committed Christian. He also spoke, wrote, and taught in English. Again, he benefited from the colonial system of education. He played organ, which was not manufactured by himself. As a preacher, catechist, singing band instructor, and a choir master, Amu's acts of defiance are to be seen in their proper context. His acts of defiance were basically related to his attempt to assert the cultural identity and dignity of the Ghanaian or African. The body he wanted to be an African, to be identified as a Ghanaian and not a Westerner. Let us now briefly examine the 4 specific forms in which Amu registered his acts of defiance. 1, Amu's use of indigenous language in preaching. Amu preached in the local language Twi. According to the biographical sketch of Laye earlier referred to, the church authorities could excuse the use of Twi language, but wearing native clothes was completely unacceptable. This raises the question, why would the church authorities excuse the use of Twi, but not the wearing of native clothes? The answer, in my view, is not too difficult to figure out. For although the English language was a symbol of prestige, superiority, and identity for the colonizer, allowing the gospel to be preached in Twi brought the colonizer and the Christian missionaries more gains than losses. In brief, the Twi language facilitated the local reception of colonialism and Christianity. In all probability then, the more local people could hear and understand in their own language that Inshani womo a womo jo na womo no mbenya asase na die. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The more local people could hear this and understand this verse in their own language, the greater their reception and veneration of the colonial master. So for the colonizer and the missionary, allowing the gospel to be conducted in the local language was both strategic and prudent. It is for the same strategic purpose that the missionaries later saw the need to translate the Bible into our local languages and to produce dictionaries, primers, and hymns for the indigenous Christians. I know that if you go to Agyekum, most people sing the Presby hymns in Agyekum Twi. They were happy with that, but wearing cloth to the pulpit was a taboo. Second, Amu's wearing of African clothes to preach. Why did the church authorities prohibit Amu from wearing African clothes? Obviously, because wearing African clothes did not generate the same strategic benefits as propagating the gospel in Twi. Besides, clothing, like language, is a great symbol of identity and personality. Amu could not be allowed to project himself above the church authorities and his other masters. Just look at the professional clothing of our judges, especially our Supreme Court judges, with all apologies to judges and Supreme Court judges here. How can anyone not be awestruck by it? For the same reasons, the preacher's European outfit, despite the tropical climate, makes him both reverential and awe-inspiring. To allow Amu to wear African clothes while preaching the gospel in Chi was to weaken and degrade Amu's agency as a symbol of the colonizers' acceptable standards and self-conception as superior, civilized, and spiritually more developed. If we allow you to be wearing that, then you are also saying that you are comparable with our wearing of suit, and that will downtrodden their superiority. Amu's defiance may also have had some unforeseen ramifications. For example, it might have exposed some of the contradictions and puzzles associated with the colonizers' avowed religiosity at the time. It might have seemed contradictory and puzzling that by wearing African clothes to preach the gospel, the church authorities accused Amu of lowering the standards of Christianity, as if the universal God was also a Caucasian who set Caucasian standards of clothing. I don't know about that in a way. Of more serious concern is the fact that in any social context, if some adults have no right to wear the clothes they have, or to wear what they find suitable to wear for an event, then those adults have no individuality, no identity, and no dignity. Check a Debar of chiefs and check what they wear. And check if any chief decides to wear trousers and t-shirt for that function. I don't know what will happen. I leave that to you. So in defying the church authorities, Amu was fighting for his identity and dignity. But this was not just a personal fight. It was an ideological fight for the identity and dignity of the Ghanaian, for you and for me and for African in general. That's what he did. Now let's look at the third defiance. Amu's use of locally composed songs for worship and praises. It is possible that Amu did not intend his songs to be practical or political protest against colonialism. But we all know that performing artists love indirection and tend to speak or communicate metaphors, a poetic strategy which enables them to escape between different interpretations of their work, which seek to accuse and censor them. For the sake of time, I'll limit myself to only one of Amu's songs, namely Asemi Edikan. And I will ask our choir to sing that for us. Asemi Edikan. Note, they didn't applaud for that. Asemi Edika. Note that the song was written in 1944, at the height of Amu's iconic defiance of cultural imperialism. The first person voice in the song, Mia, seeks to champion a cause which embodies and reflects the interest of all, but which no one has the courage to articulate. Hence, Asemi Edika. Why na ekoka? Obia boto. Mia. He had the courage. So if you listen to the first stanza as we have, we're going to find that it's just me. Allowing the possibility that the subtext of Asemi Edika is Amu's defiance of cultural imperialism, the song can be seen as, in some sense, resonating with Bob Marley's redemption song, especially emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. And also the lines that say, how long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? If Amu had written the last two lines in the 1930s, I'm sure he would most probably have used the word culture instead of prophets. For the simple reason that the killing of our African prophets, namely our African visionary leaders, had not started in the 1930s. But cultural imperialism had long started. So Amu may have written, how long shall they kill our culture while we stand aside and look? And I'm sure today it's a living. How long shall we continue for them to kill our culture while not only standing, but sitting and watching? Anyway, now the fourth form of Amu's defiance, namely Amu's remarkable character. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is true that Amu's specific acts of defiance emanated from his character. However, every character has inherent qualities which are not fully exhibited or displayed by the clothes one wears or the language one speaks. Your language or your clothes or the food alone cannot determine your character. So your character is within you. So while it is true to say that Amu's specific acts of defiance of cultural imperialism reflected his character, these acts do not fully reflect or constitute a substitute of his character. If so, what can we infer about the nature of Amu's character from the snippets of his biography? According to Agyekum, and I quote, Amu's efforts to make Christian church worship more meaningful to African worshippers occurred at a time in our history when many literate and school-educated Africans were ashamed of their own culture in clothing, language, music, and even their African names. That was the time people were taking Saul, Paul, Peter, John, Wilberforce, George, all along. They were even ashamed of their own African names. In other words, at the time of Amu's iconic defiance of cultural imperialism, the colonizers had virtually succeeded in whitewashing the minds of the Africans, making them pliable admirers of white people and whatever they fancied. This is an instance of mental slavery. I don't know whether it is still continuing or it has stopped. Mental enslavement normally escapes notice because its victims unconsciously carry it about as part of their own mindset. But Amu keenly observed the African predicament and might have concluded that Saa Asemi Edika. Consequently, his acts of defiance reflected a strongly felt obligation not only to draw the attention of his fellow Africans to their mental enslavement, but to invite them to join in asserting our African identity and dignity. Furthermore, he was ready to go it alone, if necessary, whatever the consequences. Hence, Hinan Obeka, Miaro, Miara. But it's not all about Amu's character. Probably the best part of Amu's character was his willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of doing what is right. Let us recall that when he mounted the pulpit dressed in Toma in 1931, he was banned from preaching and was given an ultimatum to change his mind, that if you change your mind, we allow you to continue with your preaching. In fact, he was also baited with the prospect of being ordained as a clergyman, Ubebo collar, if you stop wearing the cloth. If he would change his mind, but Amu stood his ground. We must also remember that Amu was teaching at a Kropon training college and earning a living for his services. So he knew that continuous defiance of his colonial paymasters will result in his being dismissed from his job and not being paid. He was aware of all this, but that did not move him. In explaining his defiance, Ajimai writes that Amu was convinced that he was doing the right thing by researching, understanding, and enhancing African culture. This explanation is important, for it reminds me of the ancient Greek moral philosopher called Socrates, who in Plato's Apology told his compatriots, and I quote, "A truly good person is one who is moved to action by one and only one consideration, whether what he is about to do is right. Once he can determine the rightness of the action, considerations of what he loses or gains, or even whether he dies doing the right thing, are irrelevant." And that's exactly what Amu was doing. You can stop paying me, that's fine, but I'm standing on my grounds that I want my African identity and dignity. If this is a true or at least a fair assessment of Amu's character, then Amu counts among the few moral exemplars who ever walked or will ever walk on this earth. Is one of the type of moral exemplars who makes substantial contributions to society by championing a public cause. And this was through displaying extraordinary integrity, courage, and strength of character, and being disposed at times to sacrifice their own prospects, privileges, and advantages for the common good. In sum, it is reasonable to say that Amu symbolizes the moral challenge to fight ideologically for our cultural identity and dignity, whatever the consequences. However, putting the matter that way may attract the objection that a necessary distinction must be made between us today and Amu. According to this objection, Amu had to fight by means of defiance because the colonizers and their Christian agents were physically present. You could see them day in, out. And defiance was the most appropriate way to fight them. So if they say, go by this direction, Amu will say, I'll go by that direction. They will see him. But in the age of cultural globalization that we found ourselves in, Amu's kind of fight will not work, given that our cultural oppressors are not physically present or visible. In my view, this objection has no traction. In fact, today, far more than in Amu's time, there's greater need to fight by defiance for cultural identity and dignity. To see that this is indeed the case, let us take a brief look at the post-Amu age, the age of cultural globalization. Mr. Chairman, even though Amu died in 1995, only about 30 years ago, so next year will be 30, he registered his iconic defiance of cultural imperialism in the early 20th century. He did so before the recent unprecedented advances in technology and globalization, especially cultural globalization, which is having significant implications for the survival of our cultural identity and dignity. It is therefore relevant to be worried about and to inquire into the implications of cultural globalization for the future of cultural identity and dignity. In his J.B. Dankwa Memorial Lectures, titled Beyond Cultures, published in 1999, Gyechi made a strong case for the cultural benefits which could accrue if Ghanaians or Africans actively participated in the global arena in the competitive creation of cultural products. According to Gyechi, active participation in the global arena will enable us to perfect ourselves, provided our cultural products meet international standards of functional acceptability. This is insightful and the way to go. However, I found Gyechi's other argument problematic. The argument that globalization cannot sweep away our cultural identity. I have a problem with that. Here's what he writes, and I quote, "Globalization does not and will not drastically distort or deface the identity of a culture." He continues, "No amount of Coca-Cola Ghanaians consume, no quantity of Kentucky Fried Chicken or fish and chips Ghanaians eat will make them lose their national or cultural identity." I don't know. Gyechi concedes that globalization will involve homogenization of cultures in some respects. He, however, insists that there will be no tension or conflict between homogenization of cultures and the preservation of local cultures and identity. This was because, to him, homogenization will occur at the level of values that human beings have in common and the basic needs that will need to be fulfilled. This includes respect for human rights, democratic governance, market economic systems, and the pursuit of science and technology. Gyechi concludes that the homogenization of cultures will not include particularities of local national cultures, such as dance forms, festivals, inheritance system. He should have lived to see what is going on this year. Certain social structures, ceremonies for the dead, and many customary practices of a local culture. Although no one can be certain about the future, it is fair to suspect that Gyechi was too optimistic about the future. It is fair to suspect that he was too optimistic about the future of our cultural identity and dignity. It is possible that our national or cultural identity cannot all be lost through globalization. That is true and fair, but some amount, possibly a significant amount, could be lost in the long run. And that is where we have to be careful. For in situations of globalized clash between the fundamental values of hegemonistic cultures and those of ordinarily marginal or peripheral cultures, the former will win and the latter will lose. China prints in large commercial quantities of African cloths with African designs. And who could have imagined that anti-LGBTQ plus bill in Ghana or other parts of Africa will have implications for access to international financing? Whoever thought that? Sexual orientation, we all know, lies deep in the DNA of humanity, human survival, and individual cultures. So if different cultural orientations of sexuality can become globally and politically homogenized, what else in a weak, marginal, or peripheral culture is so sacred and secure as to be immune to the economics and policies of globalization? For the avoidance of doubt, and don't quote me anywhere, I'm not talking about the president assenting or not assenting to Parliament's enactment of anti-LGBT something Q bill. That's not what I'm referring to. That, in fact, is a constitutional issue that I don't have the power to say anything about it. But the power I have is that how can that be something that can affect us in accessing financial? It's not part of cultural imperialism. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that the globalization process is not entirely driven by impersonal and deterministic forces, as it appears to be. It also contains hegemonistic cultures flexing and leveraging their political and economic powers for ideological purposes. It is a kind of Darwinian battlefield of competing hegemonistic cultures in which the identities of the weaker, marginal, or peripheral cultures are not guaranteed to survive unless they are fought for. This suggests that the continuous existence of cultural identity and dignity cannot be taken for granted, but require us to dispose ourselves, fight ideologically to preserve and protect them, just as Amu did. This conclusion leads me to the next section, which briefly looks at how the state has positioned itself to preserve and protect our cultural identity and dignity. So how has the state of Ghana positioned itself? Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with the 1992 Constitution. Under the broad umbrella of the directive principles of state policy in Chapter 6. Article 39 deals with cultural objectives. According to Article 39, the cultural objectives are to guide any cultural policy in Ghana. There are 4 of such objectives, each being a clause under Article 39 of our Constitution. Here are the objectives. Article 39(1) reads, "The state shall take steps to encourage the integration of the appropriate customary values," and I'm concerned about appropriate customary values, "into the fabric of national life through formal and informal education and the conscious introduction of cultural dimensions to relevant aspects of national planning." So nice and nicely written. 39(2) reads, "The state shall ensure that appropriate customary and cultural values are adapted and developed as an integral part of growing needs of the society as a whole, and in particular that traditional practices which are injurious to the health and well-being of the person are abolished." 39(3) says, "The state shall foster the development of Ghanaian languages." I'm sure you heard that. Foster the development of Ghanaian languages and pride in cultural Ghanaian culture. So, when I read this, I was reflecting in my mind, how about the change of policies on mother tongue education? Anyway, 39(4), this is a constitutional matter. 39(4) says, "The state shall endeavor to preserve and protect places of historical interest and artifacts." Mr. Chairman, I'll return to these objectives shortly, especially 39(1) and 2. But for now, let me introduce the National Commission on Culture, hereafter NCC. Although it was established under PNDC Law 238 in 1990, that was 2 years before the coming into force of the 1992 Constitution. The NCC has assumed responsibility for implementing the cultural objectives of the state in the 1992 Constitution. In pursuit of this mandate, the NCC oversaw the creation in 2004 of a cultural policy of Ghana. This policy is currently under review. Since the review is not complete, all references to the cultural policy of Ghana is to the 2004 cultural policy. The policy document is wide-ranging. It covers every key aspect of our culture as it attempts to roll out the cultural objectives in the Constitution. I will address only 3 issues that are both relevant to our topic this evening and are also likely to generate implementation challenges for those whose mandate is to implement Article 39(1) and 2 of the Constitution or the cultural policy. The first issue of interest occurs in Chapter 2 of the cultural policy under the section titled Specific Objectives. I wish to draw attention to the occurrences of the words aware and awareness in Objectives 1, 4, and 9. Specific Objective 1 says that the policy seeks to create awareness of the traditional values and generate pride and respect for the nation's heritage. Specific Objective 4 says that the policy seeks to make the people of Ghana aware of the contemporary relevance of their traditions and cultural heritage and assist local communities to mobilize their cultural resources for human and material development. Specific Objective 9 says that policy seeks to promote the cultural awareness of the youth through formal and non-formal education to ensure that they are prepared to play their role in the cultural life of their communities. These three specific objectives of the policy provide us with a partial view of how the policy roll out Article 39(1) and 2 of the Constitution. Creating awareness of the contemporary relevance of our traditions presupposes some level of understanding of our traditions and their interface with contemporary society. However, creating or promoting awareness of a culture or its values is not enough. It is not enough because it predominantly makes us passive consumers of our culture and its values. We are aware of the culture. Are we participating in them? If not, then we are just passive consumers. Moreover, mere awareness can easily be swept away by more seductive foreign cultural forces. So beyond awareness, there's the need to find effective ways of developing participation. 1, understanding. 2, appreciation of the traditions and their values, especially the core values of our tradition. This may be achieved educationally, especially as the policy talks about the NCC, making inputs into the preparation of curricula for all educational institutions. Pride in one's culture is anchored in being merely aware of it, but it's not anchored in being merely aware of it, but in having an understanding and appreciation of the values of that culture. It is such appreciation or conviction which grounds internalization of the culture into the people's heart, mind, and their behavior. If we're able to do that, then it will dispose us to project, uphold, and fight for our cultural identity and dignity, whatever the consequences. As Jachi ably argued in his Tradition and Modernity, there's no direct passage from being merely aware of a value to being motivated by it to do something. You need to be committed to that value. So when you become aware, you have to be motivated, and you should be committed. And commitment goes beyond mere awareness. It is commitment which forms attitudes, and attitudes dispose us to act or to respond to relevant situations. To see the relevance of the distinction between being merely aware of our culture and having a conviction of its values, let us recall AYEE's biographical snippet about Amu. The church authorities judged that by wearing African attire in the pulpit, Amu was lowering the standards of Christianity and drawing back the clock of civilization, since its action offended the sensibilities of the majority of educated and non-educated. Note that Amu's wearing of African attire in the pulpit offended the majority of his fellow Africans, both the educated and non-educated. when it comes to being aware of the African culture and its values, Amu was not different from the other Africans. They all know their culture. They were aware. But what distinguishes Amu from the Africans he offended was that beyond being aware, Amu also had understanding and appreciation of his culture and its values. He had an appreciation that his dignity and identity reside in his culture and his values, an appreciation which made him proud and disposed him to project, uphold, and defend his culture, whatever the cost. Because Amu's fellow Africans were merely aware of their culture, which some of us find ourselves being aware of our culture, because they were just passive consumers of their own culture, because they had no deep convictions regarding the value of their culture, they could not withstand the seduction and the allure of Western culture. To preach the gospel from the pulpit while wearing an African attire was believed to be lowering of the standards. The second challenge which implementers of the culture policy are likely to face is how to handle the dynamism of culture. Article 39.2 provides that the state shall ensure that appropriate customary and cultural values are adapted and developed as integral part of the growing needs of the society as a whole. I want to emphasize the phrase, the growing needs of the society as a whole. In particular, the word need. In the acknowledgement of the cultural policy, the then chair of NCC wrote as follows: the document will from time to time be reviewed to reflect the changing needs of time. Chapter 6 of the cultural policy also uses the concept of need. It states that in paragraph 10.1.2, the state shall ensure that industrialization is introduced in a manner compatible with the developmental needs of rural dwellers, with a view to preserving their dignity and heritage. You may wonder, what is problematic about adapting and developing culture to meet the growing or changing or developmental needs of the people? The problem is this: when we say, for example, that someone is in need, we mean that the person lacks something. And that what the person lacks ought not to be allowed to continue. Because if it continues, some goal or standard of some appropriate level of human function will not be attained, or some rule will be breached. Here's an example. If we say that pensioners need an increased pension, I hope some of us here are pensioners, then we mean that there exists some inadequacy in the circumstances of the pensioner's life. And this observed inadequacy presupposes a standard of living being regarded as so desirable that pensioners ought not to be allowed to fall below it. The appropriate remedy will be increase in pension, which we need, to adjust it to inflation from time to time, so that pensioners can sustainably live the required standard of life. The two examples I've just given on the use of concept of need indicate that adapting and developing culture to meet the growing or changing of developmental needs of the people is a complex issue. It requires that our culture experts should be able to detect falling standards in cultural life. And I tell you that the cultural life of Ghanaians is falling. And we have to do something about it. And be able to determine the appropriate responses. And be able to ensure that the uniqueness and identity of Ghanaian culture or its values will survive the various periodic adaptations and developments. Even where the cultural experts have identified a need and have recommended a solution, it does not follow that the people will accept it, unless they felt the need as such. Let me illustrate this point. A couple of decades ago, but still under the 1992 Constitution, an MP honored an invitation to the annual festival of a community within his constituency. The chief in his speech listed a number of things that the town needs. In his response, the MP told the chief and his people that he does not have all the funds to provide all the needs at the same time, but he can immediately provide what he believed was the most important need from the point of view of the MP, namely the provision of boreholes for access to potable water. The people lived on water from a nearby stream. To the MP's surprise, the people rejected the potable water as their first priority and opted for the provision of new brass band instruments. We are talking about needs. For them, the provision of new brass band instruments was sweeter than potable water. The conclusion is that the word need is a complex idea, and so claims like adapting culture to changing, growing, and developing needs are difficult and must be handled with care. Here's another example of the challenge that potentially exists when our culture is to be periodically adapted and developed to meet growing or changing or developmental needs of the people. Consider that in the last 5 years alone, there has been a mushrooming of Ghanaian social media platforms. One way of understanding this phenomenon is that our democracy is growing and working. People are exercising their human rights of free speech to express their views on matters of public interest to them. These platforms provide a wide diversity of opinions on virtually all issues that become public. Everywhere you go, you find people in buses, cars, eating houses, drinking bars, workplaces, or in their privacy, accessing social media platforms to enjoy the kinds of stuff and to comment. Obviously, then, social media platforms appear to be a growing need that could facilitate democracy. However, the side effects, especially their impact on our cultural values, are so obvious. Indeed, there are social media platforms which specialize in indecent and intemperate language as standard ways of expressing opinion or of expressing disagreement with authority or others. Some of us have already had our share of the insults. There was a time they said, my head is like a watermelon. So these are social media platforms. These are among the most popular platforms where the insults are abundant, are the ones that are very popular. On such platforms, there's no respect for elders or for authority. You can be the president, vice president, Utumfo, Domahene, Nana, Osajifo Amotia. Whoever you are, they will insult you. You can be the vice chancellor, either current or past. There's no sober reflection. Disagreements are solved not by reasoning, but by insults, couched in the most vulgar language. What is the response of the cultural policy to situations like this? We have the need to get social media, but the ramifications are what we have to think. The third implementing challenge of the cultural objectives refers to the phrase appropriate cultural values in Article 39.1. These are to be integrated into the fabric of our national life. And Article 39.2 says that we must adapt and develop the cultural appropriate values to meet the growing needs of the society as a whole. The emphasis is on the phrase adapting and developing appropriate cultural values. The requirement to adapt and develop appropriate cultural values allows for a creative transformation of a culture without sacrificing its uniqueness. But we need to be guided by search for or discover or identify appropriate cultural values. The cultural policy talks about positive values, which may be taken to refer to or to mean the same as appropriate cultural values. But the policy takes what a positive value is for granted and does not define it. It is true that some cultural values can be transparently positive, but some are not. It might be supposed that Article 39.2 settles the issue. For 39.2 encourages the abolition of traditional practices which are injurious to health and well-being of the person. And in a sense, any cultural value whose practice is injurious to the health and well-being of a person cannot be appropriate or positive. However, it would be a mistake to conclude that the only criterion of being appropriate or a positive cultural value is not to be injurious to the health and well-being of a person. There are so many cultural values and practices which are not obviously injurious to the health and well-being of a person, yet they are without any obvious intrinsic value for preserving or promoting our cultural identity and dignity. For example, Ghanaians value the dead. We all do. I like funerals more than weddings. We value the dead. But consider the extraordinary expenditure of time, energy, and finances funeral celebrations bring about. Food for thought. Jachi urged that we make a critical evaluation of the elements of the cultural past, examining and analyzing their functionality, or determine which one of them will fit into and enhance our contemporary cultural life, and which cannot and deserve to be left behind. He reminds us that even the Sankofa bird does not return for all the seeds it left behind, and will also spew out seeds that it finds rotten. So there are certain cultural issues that we are not obliged to go for them. We have to do critical Sankophaism, select those that will be good for our contemporary life. In any event, we need some conceptual clarity on what positive or appropriate cultural values are. This will help us to promote both national awareness and the understanding and appreciation of our appropriate cultural values. Conceptual clarity on what positive or appropriate cultural values are will also enable us to track and prevent erosions of these values, and to ensure that we can adapt and develop them without losing their intrinsic values. Mr. Chair, I now come to the final section, which is conclusions and recommendations. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, we are told that whatever has a beginning has an end. At this point, I enter the fifth last section of this presentation, namely conclusions and recommendations. Here is a summary of what we've done so far. Session 1 was a brief account of Amu's biography, and that set the context of Amu's life for subsequent evaluation. Session 2 teased out from Amu's biography the scope and significance of Amu's defiance of cultural imperialism. In session 2, I argued that our dignity is bound up with our identity. In fighting for his African identity, Amu was also concerned with his dignity. He also noted that Amu's acts of defiance reflected a strongly felt obligation not only to draw the attention of his fellow Africans to their mental enslavement, but also to invite them to join in asserting our identity and dignity. Hence, Asem Yidika. Furthermore, he had the will and the strength of his convictions to go it alone, if necessary, and whatever the consequences. Session 3 gave a brief look at the post-Amu age, namely the age of globalization, especially cultural globalization. I've argued that cultural globalization poses a greater threat to the survival of our cultural identity than the physical colonialism. its social penetration, its scope of influence, and the erosion of weaker cultures is swift and relentless. Again, despite its quiet, faceless, and impersonal appearance, it is driven by hegemonistic cultures, leveraging their political and economic powers for ideological purpose. We therefore had a kind of Darwinian battlefield, competing hegemonistic cultures in which the identities and dignities of weaker, marginal, or peripheral cultures are not guaranteed to survive unless they are fought for, just as Amu did. The clear implication is that Amu's relevance is both assured and highlighted by the continuing threat of cultural globalization to the survival of our cultural identity and dignity. In session 4, we looked at how the state of Ghana has positioned itself to protect and preserve our cultural identity and dignity. In view of the threat to the survival of cultural identity posed by cultural globalization, we have to look at the objectives of the state policy set out in Article 39, alongside the cultural policy of Ghana enacted in 2004. We found out that although the policy document is wide-ranging, the presentation of our culture encourages passive public consumption of culture. Passive public consumption of our culture. There's little, if any, of active engagement that leads to appreciation of our culture and its values. Active engagement and understanding will result in internalizing our appreciation of the cultural values and will facilitate the formation of attitudes that will dispose us to project, promote, defend our culture and its values, wherever we are and whatever the cause. Besides, there are conceptual challenges within the text of the policy and the Constitution, which may impede the effective implementation of the cultural policy. I've already argued for the need to operationalize such terms as appropriate or positive cultural values and adapting and developing appropriate cultural values to growing, changing, and developmental needs. Here are some few recommendations. Mr. Chairman, these recommendations are intended to strengthen the existing national cultural policy or the new one under review in the event that the new one does not address the issues addressed in the following recommendation. Recommendation number 1. Within any culture, there are many cultural values, but usually only some few values are core or central. Core values are core because they build and harmonize communities and social relations, and other values, directly or indirectly, will depend on them. In some societies, justice, temperance, piety, courage are core or among the core. In other communities, like ours, compassion, honesty, or truth-telling, respect for elders and authority count among the core values. Identifying core Ghanaian values will enable us to focus moral education more systematically, as it will help develop appropriate and more effective curricula. As long as the core values we identify are Ghanaian values, it does not matter whether other cultures share the same values. After all, we are different cultures. After all, common humanity presupposes that core cultural values will not differ significantly from other cultures to one another. Parallel to the public presentation of Ghanaian cultures, to promote awareness of them, there must be more modes of presentation. These include educationally tailored programs of activity, which consciously combine awareness and participation with approaches for the understanding and appreciation of the unique qualities of our cultures and their values. 3, a future national cultural policy of Ghana must provide conceptual clarity for such key expressions as positive or appropriate cultural values. A future cultural policy of Ghana, number 4, must provide parameters for periodically adapting and developing appropriate cultural values to meet growing, changing, and developmental needs. This will advance understanding and increase the opportunities for implementation by the implementing bodies and by individuals and groups. Finally, following from the above parameters for periodically adapting and developing appropriate cultural values, it must ensure that the series of periodic adaptations and developments will not result in the erosion of the intrinsic qualities of those cultural values. We can use the adapted and developed values to project, promote, and defend our cherished cultural identity and dignity. Thank you, and God bless you all. Okay, we need another music, and then I do my acknowledgement, and then I take my seat. I'm sure before we leave here, Assembly Deacon will be sung. So, Mr. Chairman, before I take my seat, please permit me to make some few acknowledgements. Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir. Many thanks to the Almighty God for bringing me this far. I also acknowledge the training and education I have received from all my teachers and lecturers, and my Professor Defiance right here. To Professor Kofi Aka, my Nzima friend, who edited and gave constructive criticism to the drafts, I say Agyekum. I want to thank my sponsor, Mr. Justice Kwaku Buampong, the Director of Parcels, VIP Transport, Accra, Kumasi, Sunyai, and Tamale. Then the Emmanuel Presby Church, Medina, and all those who are gathered here, invited guests, including my former Vice Chancellor, Professor Iboy Tego. Thank you, sir. Finally, I cannot leave my nuclear and extended family, starting from my lovely wife, Mrs. Agyekum, my sisters, my brother, Kofi Ajimai Prempe, my sons, daughters, nephews, nieces, Emmanuel Asare, Dr. Eric Dakon, Dr. Kwesi Akomi Agyekum, Dr. Efia Atta Boacho Agyekum, and of course, my lovely pension baby, Mefia Akomia Bulls Agyekum. And my classmate, Justice Kwesi Dapa, we have been classmates since T1 in training college, is also here. And Mr. Pepra, a fraternity in Akan language. Thank you, one. Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Please, let's give him a round of applause again. He's spoken for over 1 hour, and I will not attempt to summarize. I have only 2 points to make from the whole presentation. The first one is the personality and the character of Ephraim Amu. Whether we like it or not, he was human. He had his weaknesses. But at the same time, he produced a resilient character. He had, certain beliefs and values. And those beliefs and values were against authority. But he decided to pursue them. And so in our modern day, in our lives, we are confronted with our beliefs and our values versus authority. Which one will you take? Ephraim Amu decided to stick to his values, to stick to his beliefs. And I think that is very commendable. The second thing which I would like to flag is the whole issue of culture. These days, when you mention culture in Ghana, is it positive? Is it negative? What can we do? Our culture has been adulterated. The speaker made the point that our culture has declined. If it has declined, what do we do? Maybe we need a cultural revolution or a cultural reorganization. And so he mentioned issues about the development or the design of a new cultural policy. To what extent will that new policy take into account the decline? Is something that we need to think about. But the main issue is that whether we like it or not, culture must be relevant to the development of the country. Is our culture relevant to the development of Ghana, or it is retrogressive? These are the issues that we need to discuss. And maybe we need a national forum on culture, or maybe the academy may have to have, a public forum on our culture, because it has come up, several times. How do we make sure, especially when we have a whole thing called, or mantra called, globalization? And where globalization comes in, is it distorted? Is it distorting our culture? Is it promoting our culture? What is globalization doing? And I think that a national forum or public forum on our national culture is imperative. My final point is the whole issue of the states in promoting our culture. He mentioned the National Commission for Culture. What is it doing? Is it still alive, or it is hibernating, or it is sleeping, or what is it doing? Maybe the time has now come for the National Commission on Culture to wake up and deliver its mandate. Thanks a lot, Professor Kofi Agyekum. We thank you for this illuminating lecture, and we hope that the discussion will be taken up by the various media. Thanks a lot.
Please, let's also appreciate the chair for chairing this. Please, we are told the family of Dr. Ephraim Amu are here. If they can please stand for us to acknowledge them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming and for giving Ghana such a nation builder, a passionate promoter and preserver of our culture, and such an iconic personality. Thank you very much. We also want to appreciate the President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Science, Professor Kofi, for coming and for gracing the occasion, and also the Vice President for the Sciences section, Professor Isabella Kwache, and then a former Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana, Professor Defiance. Thank you very much for coming. Let's also acknowledge Professor CMB Tego, my own former Vice Chancellor. Actually, I have two promotions under Professor Tego. Thank you very much. Let's acknowledge the wonderful music from the Emmanuel Choir. Thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate you. We also want to appreciate all fellows and invited guests for making the time to be present. And to all of you, thank you very much for coming and for exhibiting such defiance to the rain. Please, just some few housekeeping rules, and then we'll be out of here. So we have upcoming events, and the next will be on the 20th of May, 2024, in this same auditorium at 5:30 p.m. And the lecture will be delivered, this is an inaugural lecture that will be delivered by Professor Samuel J.C. Obeng, a fellow of the Academy. And his lecture will be on the topic, Language and Liberty in Ghanaian Political Discourse. The next will be delivered by Professor Kwesi Ampeni, also a fellow of the Academy. And he will also be delivering his inaugural lecture on the topic, Performing Petition, Kete Songs, Lineage and Kinship in Akan. And that will be on the 30th of May, 2024, in this same auditorium at 5:30 p.m. I encourage all of us to come and invite others to also be present. We want to specially acknowledge sponsorship by Vipex Parcel, VIP Bus Terminal Accra. If there's a rep here, can you just give us a wave? Thank you very much. Thank you for sponsoring this lecture. Please, there'll be light refreshment right after this meeting. So don't be in a rush to run. Just spend some time and interact with others. Thank you very much.